Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, and I am delighted to be hosting this evening's talk about this book, Drunk, which we're going to hear a lot more about as the evening goes on. I'm going to introduce our guests in just a moment, but I have a little bit of housekeeping to do before we do that. First of all, I see you're chatting away in the chat. Please continue to do that and let us know where you're tuning in from. Some of us are having a little bit of a cocktail because of tonight's topic, so let us know what you're imbibing if you are so inclined. Jacques Lamar says, "Who invited Cayenne Wolf?" Brat. So keep on chatting in the chat, please. But we are going to do a Q&A session toward the end of the program. And if you have a question for either of our guests, Edward or Thomas, if you would, rather than put that in the chat, if you could do me the favor of putting that in the Ask a Question area that you see at the bottom middle of the screen, that would be a big help. That'll make it a lot easier for me to sort through the questions when the time comes. So keep chatting in the chat, but questions in the Ask a Question area, please. While we're looking at that part of the screen, I invite you to just raise your eyeballs a tiny bit and look at that long green bar that says, "Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here." I'm very, very proud of the staff and board of the Mark Twain House. We have really worked hard to stay engaged with our community and our audiences throughout the pandemic. We've provided tons and tons of virtual programs and connected with new people from all over the world. But it hasn't been free, and we rarely charge admission for any of our programs, but they are not free for us to mount. So I would just ask that if you have been enjoying our programs and have a few bucks that you might be able to share with us to help support them, we would really, really appreciate it. Every single penny that we receive is put to extremely good use and is deeply appreciated by the board and the staff. So if you can help us in that way, that's awesome. Another way you can help us is by, and I'll repost this in a moment, but at the very top of the chat, there's a link by which you can purchase a copy of tonight's book, Drunk. You get a signed copy, which is not the case if you order elsewhere. And you have the pleasure of knowing that your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum if you are to order it through us. So please consider doing that if you will. I also just want to tell you about a really important event coming up next Thursday night. It's our annual gala. We're doing it again virtually this year. It's our major fundraiser for the year. And the theme this year is Mark Twain Around the World. And we've got so many wonderful people speaking, making appearances for us. Nelson DeMille, Jill Sobule, Kevin Kwan, David Baldacci, Azar Nafisi, many, many others. So please visit marktwainhouse.org/gala. And I'll put that link in the chat as well to learn more about it and to sign up for the free event and check out all the auction items that we're offering too. Really awesome. I want to thank our sponsors tonight. Our program is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public, WNPR. And the program is produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who was one of our beloved trustees who passed away last year. So we're grateful to have the opportunity to honor him in this way. Let me introduce our guests tonight. Author Thomas Nenortis, who wrote Victorian Hartford Revisited, is an old Burnside paper mill. He's in the old Burnside paper mill on the banks of the Hockanum River Falls in East Hartford. And he's going to tell you a little bit about his journey to create America's first hydro-powered distillery/brewery blending house. He's an avid collector, connoisseur of history, architecture, and genealogy, and the founder of Quiver Spirits. He maintains strong ties to the Hartford region, where his family first settled in 1949. He's a good friend and a great member of the Hartford community. We're delighted to have him talking with Edward Slingerland, who is a distinguished university scholar and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, with adjunct appointments in psychology and Asian studies. He's the director of the Database of Religious History, and he's the author of Trying Not to Try, which was named one of the best books of 2014 by The Guardian and Brain Pickings, and covered widely in such outlets as the New York Times and The Atlantic. He's given talks on the science and power of spontaneity at a variety of venues across the world, including TEDx, Maastricht, and 2 Google campuses. And he's done numerous interviews on TV, radio, blogs, and podcasts, including NPR, the BBC World Service, and the CBC. And of course, he's here talking with with us this evening about his brand new book, Drunk, which I can't wait to hear him talk about. So give me just a moment to bring Edward and Thomas up on screen and say hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, hello.
Hello, Tom and Edward. Welcome. So good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
So, Tom, will you let me know when it's time for me to come back on screen to help with the Q&A?
I will.
All right. Well, then I'm going to sit back and enjoy the program with everybody else and have fun. We'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.
Hey, Edward, great to meet you.
Yeah, great meeting you.
Very thought-provoking book. I took it on a little business trip last week, so it was quite educational, more than I really anticipated. So I got a bunch of questions for you. First,
great.
Wanted to lift the dram to you and say cheers on a read.
Cheers.
And I invite the audience to drink along as well. So I'll just start off. What was your desire to do all this amazing research to kind of come up with the theme of this book?
There's a couple routes. So, my main specialty is early Chinese philosophy. And then I write a book called Drunk. And so my colleagues are a bit puzzled about how I got there. It's actually not as strange as it sounds. So my earlier trade book, Try Not to Try, was about this ideal in early China of effortless action. That's how I translate this term, wu wei. So it's a state where you're spontaneous, you're relaxed, you're creative, people like you. We have this kind of interpersonal charisma. The early Chinese thinkers want that state, but they face this problem. It's the problem I call the problem of how do you try not to try? If you know you need to be relaxed to be successful, and you tell yourself relax, you're not going to relax. So it is directly, as I talk about in the book, it's from a cognitive scientific perspective, it's directly paradoxical to try to force yourself to relax, because the part of your brain you're activating is actually the part you need to shut down. And so in Try Not to Try, I walk people through the various strategies these early Chinese thinkers came up with to kind of trick you, get you around the paradox. So meditate, listen to your breath, do these ritual practices. But at one point it occurred to me, there's a story in one of these texts where a drunken person is compared to the Taoist sage, to someone who's in the state of effortless action. And it's just meant as a metaphor, but that made me start thinking maybe culture, alcohol as a tool to get around of trying not to try. You want to get into a state of spontaneity. You can't consciously will yourself into spontaneity. One trick is this technology that can basically kind of reach into your brain and turn the conscious part of your brain down a few notches. So that was the seed of the idea for this book, is why cultures all around the world throughout history have been using alcohol as a tool in this way.
Yeah, so this basically goes into my next question of two evolutionary mistakes where there are the hangover versus hijack theories. And I'll just explain briefly to the audience. The hangover is something plagued by behaviors and drives that were once adaptive but no more, or a hijack, illicit way to tap into a pleasure system originally designed to reward other more adaptive behaviors. But are these inadequate explanations to explain why we drink? Question 2.
Yes. So once I started thinking about this, I got into the scientific literature, and what I found was evolutionary mistake stories about why we drink. So the hijack hypothesis, a classic evolutionary hijack, is, as I talk about at the beginning of the book, masturbation, right? Or any type of non-reproductive sex. Evolution gives us this reward, this really great reward, the best one it has, for doing the thing that most directly serves its purposes, which is passing on our genes to the next generation. But humans and other species have figured out a way to game the system and get the payoff without doing the thing it was supposed to be for originally. But in this case, evolution can afford to look the other way because it's not very costly. It basically does the job good enough, or we wouldn't be here to talk about it. So the dominant theory in the science of alcohol, the evolutionary science of alcohol, is that that's what alcohol is. It's this kind of it triggers this reward circuit just by mistake. It just the ethanol molecule happens to fit in there. And so we're getting this pleasure payoff for no good reason. That's the dominant story. There are also a couple various types of hangover theories. So maybe alcohol was originally adaptive. Taste for alcohol was originally adaptive because it led us to fruit in the jungle. So Robert Dudley, who's a primatologist at Berkeley, has monkey hypothesis that our ancestors who could smell alcohol coming off of overripe fruit could follow the waft of ethanol to find this big package of calories. And so it was adaptive back in our evolutionary past, but now that we live in a modern culture where we can get distilled liquors and wine and beer in the supermarket, it's maladaptive. And there's various types of hangover. There's the dirty water hypothesis that it was adaptive because untreated water was dangerous to drink, so we made beer out of it. And none of these are really satisfying. And so I got interested in why people use alcohol as a technology. And then when I looked at the scientific literature and saw it was all about evolutionary mistakes, it didn't make any sense to me because alcohol is very costly. It's actually physiologically costly. Yeah, it's not good for you. From a purely medical perspective, it's a dangerous substance. And especially because the estimate is possibly up to 15% of the human population has a genetic propensity to alcoholism. And so for those people, it's super dangerous. And it's economically costly. It's physiologically costly. It doesn't and we've been doing it forever all over the world. So it just doesn't make sense that the taste for alcohol has been allowed to remain in our motivational system unless there are benefits that are essentially paying for the cost. So that's what I kind of went in search of, was what are the possible benefits that pay for the obvious costs.
So kind of a two-part follow-up question to that is where the hypothesis that we could not have civilization without intoxication, and that intoxicants lured us into civilization. So that was very thought-provoking when I read that. So if you'd like to expound on that.
Yeah, so the first surprise when I started doing the research was that everyone thought that our taste for alcohol is an evolutionary mistake of some type. The second surprise was that I was taught in school, and just kind of always assumed this was true, that the discovery of alcohol was a mistake. So we first got agriculture, we were making bread and growing grain, and then someone left their sourdough starter out for too long and it started to ferment, and then they tasted it and it made them feel good, and we discovered beer. That's the standard story that I learned. But when I started digging into the archaeology, there's a counter movement in archaeology that started in the 50s, that really kind of took off more recently, called the beer before bread movement. And these people are pointing out that hunter-gatherers, it's pretty clear that hunter-gatherers, so thousands of years before agriculture, were getting together, making beer and sometimes wine, getting probably monumentally drunk, and performing these intense, some kind of religious rituals. They built these massive, so I talk about the site Göbekli Tepe in modern day Turkey. It's probably at 12,000 years old. And it has these massive stone stelae with animals carved on them, and there are remnants of feasts, all these animal bones, and then these huge vats that held some kind of liquid. We don't have chemical residue evidence, so we can't prove that it was beer, but it was beer. They were not storing water in these cisterns. Hunter-gatherers were not coming from long distances to this ritual site to drink water. So this is the beer before bread idea, that actually we were motivated to settle down and start cultivating crops, not because of hunger, but because of our desire to get intoxicated. And you see this pattern not just in the Fertile Crescent, but all over the world. That the first domesticated, digging into this, it's clear that the first domesticated crops, wherever you look around the world, tend to be crops that have psychoactive properties. And some of them have no nutritional properties at all. So people are motivated to settle down and start cultivating plants to do something to their mind, not to fill their bellies. And so that's the sense in which lured us into civilization. We settled down in agricultural communities in order to make more and better beer. And we were, brought it together out of our hunter-gatherer lifestyle by the lure of beer. And then once we're there, alcohol then becomes a tool that helps us to adapt to that kind of lifestyle.
Yep. So in terms of adapting, as the civilizations developed, you kind of go into your 3 C's: creative, cultural, and communal. And do those help explain why we drink?
Yeah, so we're a weird species. We're primates, and all of our closest primate relatives live the way that we used to live in a hunter-gatherer society, in small bands where you know most of the people you're related to, or most of the people you're interacting with. This transition that happens when we move into agriculture is really dramatic. We start living in these very dense societies where we're having to cooperate with strangers all the time. We're having to innovate constantly because human species are completely dependent on tool use. And so we're constantly having to innovate, create new tools. The environment's changing. We're competing with other cultural groups that maybe have better tool sets than us. And so we're really dependent on creativity. And so what I argue in the book is that if you look at this weird ecological niche that we inhabit, we're hypersocial. We cooperate with strangers in a way that's very strange for a primate. I talk about the fact that if you put, you look at human beings. I took a plane. I'm in California right now. I flew down on a plane, and we all sat in our seats and put our seatbelts on and wore our masks.
I was actually reading that page on the airplane, so it was very
on the airplane. It's great.
thought-provoking.
And if you put, Sarah Blaffer Hardy points out that if you put a bunch of chimpanzees on a plane, 2-hour flight, you'd open the door at the other end and it'd just be body parts and blood. They would just tear each other apart. But humans are docile. We're amazingly obedient and cooperative for a primate. So when you understand that,
and that's sober,
like that, and that's sober. Yeah. But alcohol helps. Alcohol helps with that trick. And there's a good, as I point out, I don't know if I think that's in that section as well. There's a good reason why even when they were, cutting and stripping down service in planes, they still made alcohol available. People were still planes, hopefully in moderation. So we need to be cooperative. We need to get along. We need to be creative. And when you see these challenges, that gives you then an adaptive target that the power of alcohol, the functions of alcohol are going to be tracking. So that kind of understanding the challenges of our ecological niche gave me a sense of where to look for the effects and what kind of effects might be expected.
So speaking of humanity's oldest indulgence, not only does it explain why we want to get drunk, but how it actually might be good to tie one on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so most of the functions of alcohol, the positive functions, come at about 0.08 blood alcohol content. So it's about when you should not operate a motor vehicle. It's usually the drunk driving limit in most states. Probably about 2 beers for most people. That's the sweet spot. So that's when you get enhanced creativity. So you start to be able to think outside the box and engage in what cognitive scientists call lateral thinking. You start to be able to trust other people more. And we can talk more about the mechanisms of that. There's several mechanisms going on that help us get past cooperation dilemmas with other people. And so that's functions come at that sweet spot. It does seem to also be the case that occasionally blowing past 0.08 and getting seriously drunk with fellow human beings is something that people do. And may also have functions. And I don't talk about that as much in the book because I'm more interested in these kind of general functional benefits you get at moderate levels of inebriation. But there's something also about occasionally losing a sense of yourself, getting a serious vacation from the self that you get at higher levels of inebriation or using other intoxicants like psychedelics. And so there's a reason human beings use those substances as well. But that type of serious intoxication tends to be much more rare. And in most cultures, it tends to be something that either only a certain class of people does. So you have shamans whose job it is to take hallucinogens and communicate with the spirit world to give us guidance. Or in cultures where everyone's doing it, it's typically a periodic ritual. You do it once or twice a year and everyone does it together. But what I focus most of the book on is the functions of this kind of gentle relaxation of the grip of the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's in charge of conscious behavior.
So why do some cultures go to the extreme where it's almost deadly to do whatever they're trying to do, whether it be a chemical or some type of plant that's extremely harmful?
Most cultures don't stay at that extreme. So one of the puzzles is the fact that how people discovered some of these substances. So I talk about this hallucinogenic bean that grows in the Sonoran Desert. That if you take half of one of these beans, you have a very pleasant psychedelic experience. If you take a whole one, you die. It's just, you wonder like how many people died before they figured out what the dosage was. People lick poisonous toads. People, it's amazing that the dangers that we navigate and the costs that we bear willingly and the cost to get intoxicated. And again, I don't think it's just because we're like rats pushing a lever to get more cocaine in our water bottle. I think our quest to get intoxicated has these functional benefits. So cultures do take risks to discover these substances, but once they do, they tend to design cultural and religious forms to make the consumption of these substances safe or safer.
Yeah, so in terms of that extreme, and then it's kind of, I'll use the word diluted over the centuries. These echoes, as you mentioned in your book, would that explain hazing in college? Or big man on campus bringing in the keg to a keg party, and he's applauded. So if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so I make the comparison to a keg party where there were probably priests at Göbekli Tepe, and probably some of their power derived from the fact that they were providing the beer. So people were coming from all over and lugging these enormous stones around for them because they were in charge of the beer. So control over alcohol, control its production and distribution, has often been a source of political power in human societies. So that's always been the case. The hazing thing, this seems to be one of the functions of extreme drinking, is that I'm incurring a cost. If we're both doing shots together, we know that we're going to be hurting the next day. We know that we are cognitively seriously impaired right now, unable to lie, unable to really filter what we're saying. And there does seem to be some function to people letting down their guard to that degree, and also willingly sharing costs with another person. So that does seem to be one of the functions of extreme drinking, is that it seems to have a function very similar to hazing, where the dysphoric or unpleasant qualities of it are actually part of the point, as part of what is bonding people together. But again, those tend to be rare, and they tend to be in certain life stages. Which much more common is the kind of gentle bonding you get. What I'm focused on in the book is more a kind of cocktail party, after seminar beer with students, kind of gentle intoxication that's relaxing you enough to capture some of these social benefits.
Yeah, at the local pub.
Yeah.
So given the social costs of alcohol and other chemical intoxicants, why has the production and consumption of alcohol and similar substances remained at the heart of human social life?
Because it's useful. It helps us achieve goals. I gave a talk at a Google campus when I was doing the book tour for Try Not to Try. And I was talking about the relationship between spontaneity and creativity. And this study had just come out then, of the only one I know of directly measuring the effect of alcoholic intoxication on creativity. So they got people to about 0.08 and found that they performed on these lateral thinking tasks than people who were sober. And I just reported that in passing. And the first person who raised their hand for a question said, "Do you know about the Ballmer peak?" I'd never heard of this. This is supposedly Steve Ballmer, the former CEO of Microsoft. This is probably apocryphal, but supposedly discovered that his coding ability peaked at this very particular blood alcohol content, and then declined right afterwards. And so supposedly he would keep him hooked up to an IV of vodka to keep himself right at the sweet spot of intoxication. It's not true, but it captures this idea that there's that sweet spot of creativity you can get to with alcohol. And after the Q&A session, they took me on a tour of the campus, and they said, "We know we're taking you first." And they took me to their whiskey room. So they had this it was actually an amazing collection of single malt scotches, with beanbag chairs and a foosball table. And they said, when we're stuck, that we've run into a wall and we can't solve this problem that we're working on, instead of sitting in front of our computers all night and just staring at the screen, we go to this room, we pour ourselves a little bit of scotch, and we play foosball, we sit in beanbag chairs and talk. And we often, at some point, come up with a solution to this problem. And so, why have intoxicants remained part of human society? Because they help us with group innovation, both individual and group innovation. So people individually become more creative when they're a little bit intoxicated. But then also the relaxation of inhibitions. So alcohol disinhibits you, means that you come up with an idea that maybe you would think was stupid, or maybe you'd be embarrassed to say it because it's someone else's area of expertise and you don't want to step on their toes. But you've had a beer or two and you're feeling expansive, and you'll say, "Hey, why don't we do this?" And someone says, "Wow, that's a great idea." So you're more likely to come up with good ideas, you're more likely to share them, and people are more likely to be receptive to them when you're at the sweet spot about point of content. So that's one reason it's remained very important part of human culture. It helps us with innovation. Another function it plays, so I point out in the book that when Skype was invented, everyone said, well, business travel is going to just disappear. Because why would you, if you're a business person, you're interested in the bottom line, your time is valuable, why would you get on a plane and fly to Shanghai to meet with potential partners when you could just Skype? So that the prediction was, people were shorting airlines, and and in fact, until the pandemic, business travel remained unchanged. Skype had no impact on business travel. And I argue that's because in any kind of complex deal, so if I'm ordering paper clips, I'm happy to go on Amazon and do it online. Anything more complex than that, where there's any kind of leeway for misunderstanding or people not following through on exactly what they're supposed to do, especially if there's a lot at stake, I'm not going to sign a contract with you until I've sat down with you and shared a meal and drunk. I mean, there's people drink alcohol, these things, and for very good reason. So, I point out that humans often face these cooperation dilemmas where we have to trust other people. And one of the important social functions of alcohol is it paralyzes our ability to lie. So we're not as good at lying when we're a little bit drunk. And it actually increases our ability to detect lies. So we're better at picking up when there's something a little bit off with someone. And it's boosting a variety of these kind of feel-good hormones, serotonin, endorphins, that make us feel good ourselves. So we feel happy and expansive. And it also makes us like other people and judge other people more gently. So alcohol's got all these important individual and social functions that I argue have been paying for the costs over the last probably 20,000 years. We've probably been making and consuming alcohol. We've been making and consuming alcohol for as long as we've been doing anything at all in an organized fashion as a species.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be a Mark Twain conversation without a quote from Twain. So he was here commenting on the settling of the American frontier, and he famously characterized whiskey as the, quote, earliest pioneer of civilization, which would be ahead of the railway, newspaper, and missionary, which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah.
So touching on that point, why do you think, specific to America, the temperance and the prohibition ultimately failed?
Because people want to drink, and drinking is helpful in a certain way. So related to prohibition, one study I talk about in the book is this really clever correlational study by an economist where he's taking advantage of prohibition as a kind of natural experiment. So we tend to think of prohibition as something that happened all at once when the Federal Act came into being. But that's not the case. It was individual counties were imposing prohibition much earlier and in this kind of piecemeal fashion. And so he took advantage of that. So he had variation at the county level in terms of when prohibition was imposed. And that was patent applications. He looked at previously wet counties that then imposed prohibition and used patent applications as a proxy for innovation. And he found this very significant drop in patent applications after prohibition was imposed. So one of the reasons prohibition didn't work is it imposed these costs on society. Innovation went down. And he found that it tended to rebound to previous levels after about 3 years. And his theory is that's because these new speakeasies arose. So new places, underground places arose for people to drink together. But I love this study because it's a nice, but it suggests that if you impose prohibition, in theory, it should be great. And the important thing to realize is that cultures have been talking about imposing prohibition for as long as they've been making alcohol. So ancient China, one of the earliest documents from early China is a myth about the mythical sage King Yu. And he is presented with beer. So beer gets invented by this woman, and she presents him with the beer, and he drinks it. It's a great passage. It's very succinct, but he drank it. He became very happy. He looked pleased, and then he sentenced the woman to death. and declare that no one should drink this substance because it would be the end of civilization if people got their hands on this. And yet the Chinese continued producing alcohol. We have these very strict edicts where capital punishment for anyone caught with alcohol that are found in tombs that contain these enormous ritual drinking vessels and traces of alcohol. So prohibition is part of my argument is that if alcohol is only imposing costs on a society, if it's an evolutionary hijack, imposing prohibition should be a great trick. It should work, and cultures that do it should outcompete cultures that don't do it. And yet that's not what we see in the historical record. If you look at a map of where prohibition forced, it's actually a very small part of the globe. So prohibition's been remarkably unsuccessful. And my argument is that it's got to be because prohibition gets you benefits. You get all the benefits of not toxin and not spending all this money on alcohol and not waking up with a hangover. But you must be paying some costs as well. There must be losses in innovation and trust.
And kind of my last follow-up question before we take some audience questions is, I'm guilty of it myself. I know I will have a hangover in the morning. Why do I continue to drink? And my friends don't have to comment on this one. So.
Yeah, your friends may have some comments in the chat. So one of the reasons alcohol is very dangerous is that the ability it is pleasurable. It's even though I'm arguing against the evolutionary hijack theory, it is stimulating pleasure centers in our brain. It's boosting endorphins, serotonin. It's also down regulating our prefrontal cortex, which is the key to self-control and goal orientation and long-term thinking, kind of being able to delay gratification. So the dangerous thing about alcohol is the more you drink, the less you're able to stop drinking. The more you're down regulating your prefrontal cortex, the less you're able to take future consequences into account. And that becomes even more severe a problem when you're drinking distilled liquors. And so part of my argument in the book is that for most of our history, the other thing I was surprised at in my research was how recent distillation was as a real technology that people could use. So people have understood the principles of distillation forever. Aristotle wrote about it. But as you know, it's tricky to pull off in practice. And you have the benefit of a modern society that has metal. So you need metallurgy, you need to control temperature precisely. It's actually pretty tricky to pull off in practice. And I'd always assumed that we had always had liquors, but in Europe, liquors were not available on a large scale until the 1700s, which sounds like a long time ago, but I'm telling a story that starts a million years ago with primate ancestors that first adapted to eating fruit that had alcohol in it. So from an evolutionary perspective, that's yesterday. And the thing about distilled liquors, if you're drinking distilled liquor, you're getting it at a concentration that just we've never had before. Naturally fermented beers and wines top out at a certain ABV because the yeast, shut themselves down with the alcohol. Once you figure out distillation and you can pull the alcohol off and concentrate it, you can get 90-something% liquors. That stuff will blow you right past 0.08 into really dangerous territory very quickly. And so at the end of the book, I talk about the dangers of alcohol and the particular dangers that are unique to modern societies. And one of them is the access to distilled liquors, which are much more dangerous than beers and wines. And then the other is isolation. So the other reason you may keep drinking when you should know better is because you're alone. If you're drinking with other people or you're out at a pub, there are kind of built-in mechanisms for keeping drinking under control. You're matching rounds with other people. ideally, you're drinking in a place where the bartender and the servers are actually aware of your alcohol consumption and cut you off at a certain point. Human societies, drinking alone historically is very, very rare. In almost every culture, you didn't have private alcohol. The only time you got to drink was in public, at public events with rituals and all sorts of ritual regulations about when you can drink, how much you can drink. Often there's toasting. Independently, cultures have come up with this clever tricks. I mean, why do we toast? Toasting is a way to control drinking, the pace of drinking. At least in Chinese cultures, you can't drink until someone makes a toast. You don't just sit there sipping from your cup. You wait, someone makes a toast, you do a shot of this really horrible sorghum liquor. It'll get you very drunk very fast.
Well, speaking of toasts, that's a way of controlling our time limit as well.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
So thank you again. This has been awesome. Everybody get your copy of Drunk. That's a great read. And I'll invite Jennifer back to take some audience questions.
I cannot tell you how fascinating this has been. Thank you so much. And I have so many questions of my own. And I'm just going to, I don't think this came up during our conversation, talking about drinking alone, but the pandemic has brought, people are drinking way more than they ever did. And can you talk about that? I mean, obviously the pandemic has occurred after you published your book, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so it's exponentially made worse a trend that was already happening. So the trend that was already happening is in North America in particular. People were drinking more and more at home. So we were able to, it's just, the fact that you can go to a drive-through liquor store and have them load up a bunch of vodka into your truck and take it home is crazy when you look at it from a certain perspective. But then the pandemic just made it so much worse. People were in lockdown. All of the normal social cues are gone. Also, the normal temporal cues are gone, because normally, you go to work and you come home, and then drinking has a place in the evening. But when work and home are all mixed together and you're not on a normal schedule anymore, people started drinking during the day. There's evidence. I mean, it's still early times and the data is still coming in, but it looks like the pandemic radically increased just absolute quantity of drinking. So people were drinking more, and they're drinking in really unhealthy ways. So, and I found this myself. My drinking got more unhealthy during the pandemic. So it's been the hope is that, with the easing of lockdowns and people returning to drinking in person at the pub with other people, we'll get back to some healthier drinking practices. But yeah, put a bunch of people in lockdown alone with infinite access to alcohol, and that's a recipe for disaster.
And in places, I mean, here in Hartford, for instance, I don't know about the rest of the world, but you started to be able to go to a restaurant and get a margarita to go, or your favorite cocktail to go in a little takeout cup, which was never the case before. It's it's been. And
you could order liquor delivered to your house.
Responsible for that, by the way.
You were partially responsible for that.
All right. Hey, well, thank you. I mean, it came in handy a lot of times, but. And I'm invoking host privilege in a big way here, but I'm fascinated by this whole idea of the, that point where creativity is enhanced by alcohol consumption. And there are tons of books and tons of research about and lore about writers, authors and alcohol. And there's such a strong connection between writing and alcohol consumption. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Well, my point in the book is that this is cross-cultural. It's not just in the West. It's in China. It's in every culture we know of has this relationship between artists, writers, musicians, and intoxicants. And it's for a very good reason. It's alcohol is turning down. So our prefrontal cortex is a part of our brain that's in charge of goal-directed behavior and focusing and being on time and resisting temptation and thinking about tomorrow morning, which is great. We need to have that. but it impairs lateral thinking. It makes it difficult for us to connect things that seem unconnected. And kids are really great at creative tasks because their prefrontal cortex is not developed yet. It doesn't fully develop in people until the 20s, mid 20s. Yeah. And so kids. I talked about research showing that kids radically outperform adults on creativity tasks. The problem is that kids are incompetent. 5-year-olds are super creative, but they can't tie their shoes. They can't get out of the door on time. And so I argue that, the best deal grown-ups, be adults, and have all the capacities and the knowledge that we have as grown-ups, but temporarily get back to being as flexible as a 4-year-old or 5-year-old again, for a couple hours. And that's precisely what alcohol does. It takes your brain back to that earlier state of creativity for a few hours and allows you to have these kind of insights that you wouldn't have otherwise. So there's a very good reason for this connection between artists, creative people, and intoxicants.
Oh, well, thank you for that. That's fascinating. And before I go to the audience questions, I just want to, I'm bringing this up because a friend and I were talking this weekend about Johnny Appleseed, and the quote that Tom just read about Mark Twain was on the same page as your little reference to Johnny Appleseed, who was a completely misunderstood character. Yeah. Can you talk about that for a moment, please?
Yeah, this is a point made by Michael Pollan, actually. That Johnny Appleseed, the whole story of that got retold, and I think the 50s, where it's about wholesome apples for the frontier. It was not. The kind of apples that they were growing were terrible to eat, but they made really good cider. So people wanted apple trees to get drunk. They were making cider and they were making applejack. So they were making this freeze distilled liquor. And so it's Johnny Appleseed with seeds of intoxication, not wholesome, nutritious goodness. Yeah.
Sorry, folks, if that just rocks your world, but
yeah.
So Connie says, what do you think the effect of no alcohol rules are on cultures? So we talked a little bit about prohibition, which I assume is what you mean, Connie, when you say a no alcohol rule. Can you expand on that a little bit, Edward?
Well, maybe she also means just organization. So there is a trend in organizations to eliminate the use of alcohol. So corporate office parties are going dry. In academic contexts, alcohol is getting viewed with more and more suspicion. And that's where reasons for writing the book is to put my finger on the scale on this debate. Because right now, if I'm a university administrator and I have to decide if it's okay for a professor to go out to the pub with his students after a graduate seminar, I'm looking at what are the costs? Sexual harassment, drunk driving, physical costs. The costs are very clear. What are the benefits? Fun, maybe. And when fun is pitted against obvious costs, administrators are going to go with not fun. They're going to eliminate alcohol from events. And that's what we're seeing happening. But I think our decision making on this is really impaired. If we see that on the obvious costs, and they're real, and we should take them seriously. But if you see that on the other side, there's bonding, there's enhanced creativity, there's people getting to ask questions they wouldn't ask if they weren't a beer in. You're losing innovation. If you see that on the other side, your calculus might be different. And so one of the purposes of my book is to push back against this trend where alcohol is getting eliminated from our public life in various ways. And it's, at the end of the day, we may end up deciding, hey, we see the benefits, but we see the costs and we care more about the costs. We're more worried about the costs. And that would be a defensible position. But I think right now we're just not we need to make smart decisions about the role of alcohol in our individual lives or the role of alcohol in organizations.
Thank you for that. And so Connie has clarified, and then Tom Egabine in our audience also has added another question, both addressing the prohibition of alcohol in religious communities and talking about, the inhibition of creativity and, that leading to inhibition of questioning. Did you look into this at all?
So it's less common than you would think. There actually aren't that many religious communities that ban intoxicants because, religion and alcohol have always gone together. I mean, certainly in this case of Christianity, many other religions. But the ones that do, what I will talk about is interesting, is that they often replace alcohol with other intoxicating technologies. So, for instance, the Pentecostals who don't drink have these super intense prayer sessions where they work themselves up into these states of what looks like intoxication. They start speaking in tongues. They handle snakes. They, in the New Testament, there's a story about Christians being possessed by spirit, and someone says, "Oh, those people are just drunk." And I forget if it's Peter or Paul says, "No, they're not drunk on wine; they're drunk on the Holy Spirit." But that's what Pentecostals are doing. So there's, if you want, the goal is to turn the prefrontal cortex down and boost endorphins and some other hormones. Alcohol is one way to do it. Another way to do it is singing and dancing for 4 hours, or mortifying yourself, so scarifying yourself, engaging in painful rituals. Sleep deprivation will get you there. So staying up all night praying will get you there. So groups that eliminate alcohol, I think it's revealing, often introduce extreme practices that are designed to produce the same mental state that you get through chemical intoxication.
So let's talk about marijuana. And I mean, it's now legal in Connecticut and people. I live on a street where people just drive up and down the street smoking weed, and it smells like weed all the time. So, what are the differences and similarities between that kind of intoxication and the benefits and costs?
Mm-hmm. So there's a good reason that alcohol is the king of intoxicants. It's if you gave a cultural engineers the job of coming up with some substance that does a bunch of different things, alcohol would do it, and cannabis wouldn't. So the problems with cannabis has some benefits over alcohol. It's less physiologically harmful than alcohol, and it's not, the crucial thing about it is it's not physically addictive, and alcohol is very physically addictive. So it would be great if cannabis could replace alcohol. The problem is that cannabis is, the cognitive effects of cannabis really vary individual to individual. So some people, I had friends in grad school who would smoke before they went out to the club because it made them want to dance and talk to people and party. For me, smoking cannabis makes me feel super paranoid for about 10 minutes, and then I fall asleep. It's not a party drug. And everyone's been like, "Oh, you haven't had the right strain." I've tried every single strain that exists, and it does the same thing to me. So cannabis is not a good social drug because the effects of individual to individual, it varies a lot. Unlike alcohol, which has very similar effects. The other main drawback to cannabis is that it's hard to dose. So if you're smoking it, it's, you have to know how to hold it in your lungs. Depends on your lung capacity. Whereas if we're drinking beer, we all are taking the same dose. We know how much, a sip of beer is. So alcohol is very easy to dose. Cannabis is hard to dose. If you're ingesting it, the delay between ingesting it and when it comes on is really long. So it's hard to gauge. So cannabis has got a couple fatal problems with it that I think are the reason that it never displaced alcohol as the main social intoxicant.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that. So I was just going to shift over to Tom for a moment, because Tom, you are in this conversation in part because of your family business. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're up to and this business that you're in the midst of creating?
Sure. So speaking of civilizations, my people all hail from Lithuania. So we're known, I'm sure, as any other country can claim, for its drinking. So when my grandparents came over in 1949, they came with a cache of ancestral recipes. There was a bury a blade of grass or bark, they would have some type of delicious concoction for it. So about 5 years ago, our family launched a liquor company called Quiver Spirits, because it makes you quiver when you drink it. So fast forward to a year ago, last July, I responded to a Craigslist ad just looking for storage, and I happened across this quintessential New England paper mill on the Hockanum River here in East Hartford, and my life has been upturned since then. Fast forward, we're looking to create America's first hydropower distillery, brewery, and blending house. So hopefully that would make our grandparents proud.
That's great.
And it will make me very happy, because East Hartford is just across the way
Yes.
from where I live here
Uber
in
right
Hartford.
away for a lot of people.
Right? So that's awesome. So I want to ask you each, what's your favorite? What when you are imbibing? What's your alcohol of choice?
I'm a whiskey guy, so I love a good whiskey.
I love
about you,
this. This is California coastal cool climate Chardonnay that I cannot get in Canada. So whenever I'm down here, this is what I drink.
Has either, Thomas, I'm sure you've been to the Mark Twain house, but Edward, have you ever been to the Mark Twain house?
I haven't. No.
Will you change that? Will you come?
I
see
will.
us?
I will come. Yeah, my partner's lives in Cambridge, but she teaches at Dartmouth. So I'm up in Hanover, Cambridge, and Hanover a lot. So it's not that
Okay,
far.
then you have no excuse whatsoever. So
Yeah.
Please, when you can, and we'd love to give you a tour of the house. Mark Twain was a big drinker.
Yes.
And so you'd feel right at home with him. But we'd love to have you come and visit, and we'll reconvene. Tom, join us, and we'll take a tour of Mark Twain's house, and we'll take you up to his billiards room, where he
that's great.
not only drank, but he smoked 22 cigars a day. So
wow.
I'll bring the booze.
All right.
Bring some quiver.
You're great. On. So people, I cannot imagine that if you were not inclined to purchase this book before this conversation, that you're not dying to do so now. The link is in the chat. You do get a signed copy. And Edward, thank you for signing book plates for us. And please support us by purchasing the book. And thank you both for being here with us this evening. It's been really fascinating, and I can't wait to do it again.
Thanks for the invite.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. Cheers. Yeah. Cheers.
Good night. Thanks, everybody, for your good questions. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks.